Okay, missed the last squat rep. Not happy about that, but what can you do other than move on to the bench before doing the news? The United States Department of Treasury, the U.S. Treasury, Federal Reserve, and the FDIC say all Silicon Valley Bank depositors will be, quote, fully protected, and their money will be available on March 13th. Also related, Ian Withers, Reuters. HSBC plans to acquire Silicon Valley Bank UK for £1, citing, quote, strategic sense for our business, unquote. As of March 10th, SVB UK had around $5.3 billion in loans and around 6.7 billion, pounds, not dollars, in deposits. Also related, Sinead O'Sullivan, Financial Times. Having perfected the art of using hype to move markets, VCs managed to hype their own rumors to collapse SVB, accidentally slaying a much-loved accomplice. Also related, Michael Moritz, Financial Times. A eulogy for Silicon Valley Bank, a business partner to tech for 40 years, which offered services when established banks would not, and was undone by its loyalty. Also related, Ben Thompson, Stratechery. SVB bears responsibility for its demise, the outcome of disruption being tech's objective function, and the Silicon Valley myth could be the ultimate casualty. Also related, Michael Flattery, Axios. Sources, JP Morgan, PNC, Apollo, and Morgan Stanley are in talks to acquire SVB Financial Group, excluding SVB. Interest in SVB cooled after the United States backstop. Finally, also related, Mackenzie Sigalos, CNBC. Sources, long before its collapse, Silicon Valley Bank remained technologically stagnant, including failing to integrate Stripe's tech and biometric authentication on mobile. In case you can't tell, Silicon Valley Bank is the main character this morning, at least in this corner of the American and global economies. Ben Thompson's article on this is the only thing I've read thus far in detail. And a run on a bank is a lot worse when the interface with the bank is primarily software, and when moving large amounts of money does not rest on having personal, long-standing relationships with all the parties involved. The other thing that Thompson's article points out, which I thought was quite relevant, is Silicon Valley as a whole, as an ecology, if you will, was successful for many reasons, but one of them is most of the participants in that ecology understood that the value was in business investment, venture investment being an iterative game, that in effect it's a finite game, to use the traditional term. I forget who authored that book. The goal is for the game to keep happening. The goal is for the venture community and the technology entrepreneurs of the Bay Area, all of California, all of the United States, all of the planet, to continue playing the game of let's find new businesses and see which ones can make a material impact on the areas where they compete. The run on Silicon Valley Bank is an exhibit of the unfortunate sort of antithesis of that Silicon Valley mentality, which is I got to get mine because I'm afraid that I might not get mine if I wait and play it safe and allow everybody else to do what they need to do. So we're going to be talking about this story for quite some time, I'm sure. I don't think there's a lot more to be said on it today, other than we have a bank which was a integral part of the technology industry, which is now a part of the US government. And that's going to give a lot of people a lot of feelings. CNBC. New York shuts down Signature Bank as U.S. regulators cite a, quote, systemic risk exception, unquote, like for Silicon Valley Bank, announcing all of Signature's depositors will be, quote unquote, made whole. Also related, Mackenzie Sigalos, CNBC. Signature closing means its real-time payment platform Signet can no longer serve crypto clients. A blow after SEN closed. BTC jumps around 7% and USDC remains pegged. Also related, Bloomberg. The closure of Silicon Valley Bank, Silvergate, Silvergate Exchange Network, and Signature adds stress to a troubled crypto industry. Fiat conversion costs may rise by 20 to 40%. This is the other, and for my money, more, at least in the near term, sort of worthy of inspection aspect of this past week's events. Right? The Silicon Valley Bank collapse started Wednesday, Thursday, is my understanding. Closing a bank which was, whether you want to say friendly or particularly advantageous for crypto businesses to do business with, is a concern. But that's the part that's above the surface of the water. The larger chunk of problem is seeing the relationship in how Bitcoin's value moves, and I'm sure other cryptocurrencies have followed similar suit, or I would guess that they have. But seeing Bitcoin drop when a traditional financial institution collapses, and then the moment the federal government steps in and says, we will pay to make sure that everyone is whole, the important footnote there, not the equity holders in Silicon Valley Bank as a business and not the executives who operated that bank improperly, but the depositors, the private citizens who are just utilizing those services. Those people will be effectively made whole using American taxpayer dollars. To see that collapse, Bitcoin drop, and then as soon as the regulators say everybody's going to be okay, Bitcoin jumps back up. That direct relationship would, it seems like a very obvious indictment of Bitcoin's value, right? Like a lot of the crypto maxis will tell you that the reason it's useful, the reason it's meaningful, the reason we should continue to invest in it and try and build tooling and the industry around it is that it obviates the need for traditional financial institutions. So to see this tightly correlated behavior would poke a hole in that worldview. I don't disagree with that. It's certainly not a good look. I think it just continues to underscore the unfortunate reality, which is until the average individual in the developed world is able to use some form of cryptocurrency to conduct commerce, to transact with any and every entity that they choose as easily as they're able to use the traditional rails of the and interfaces of the existing financial ecosystem. We're not going anywhere. It's all academic. It's all public experiments, which are valuable. But again, if I can't get on my bike and go downtown and buy a sandwich with anything other than fiat currency, whether it is fronted by the Visa Corporation or whether it's paper notes that come out of my pocket, that's what cryptocurrency has to compete against. And today, at least in the United States, it doesn't appear able to. And that's a problem. The Verge. A Reddit user shows how Samsung's quote unquote space zoom feature produces fake generated images of the moon, highlighting how photography and quote unquote real photos are changing. This is a story. This is one of the, like, I feel like if Nilay Patel and I ever sat down and had a conversation, this is the thing I would spend an inordinate amount of time with him talking about, because I feel like he and I are very much on the same page. We stopped making photographs a long time ago. When you press the shutter button on the take a picture button, it's hilarious to even call it a shutter button, on any phone made in the last 5 years, what's actually happening is the phone is taking anywhere from a handful to, I think in some cases, over a dozen images with all different values and compositing them into a final form that it then delivers to your camera roll. So while it is especially amusing and dishonest and I don't know, upsetting, I'm sure, to some people, that Samsung's feature is dialing this notion past where anyone is comfortable with and synthesizing an image of the moon. I don't really understand how anyone has any right to be surprised. I mean, basically, we've been on the trajectory for, again, at least 5 years to a place where pressing the I want to take a picture of this button on a modern camera, that's what these things are for most of us, for many of us, it would not be that crazy if another 5 years from now, what happens is it takes a series of images and then simply uses what comes off the image sensor to produce out the other end what we today would refer to as the product of stable diffusion, right? Like completely synthetic interpretation of what a lens and a photoreactive image sensor capture, right? The analog world of light comes into a thing and we're able to interpret and capture onto a sheet of paper or glass or whatever what we see with our eyes. We left that world a long time ago. So in some ways, kudos to Samsung for pushing us all out of our comfort zones. Vishal Kalwa, the block. Lending protocol Euler Finance lost 197 million in a flash loan attack, including 136 million in ST ETH and 34 million in USDC. Euler raised $32 million in June of 2022. EUL drops more than 45%. This sounds like some extreme crypto malarkey. I don't think that anybody wants to live in a world where your conception of what a financial institution is susceptible to something described as a flash loan attack. This is one of the unintended but painfully, in hindsight, obvious consequences, I suppose, of putting money, transmuting money into software and putting it on the internet. I don't know what Euler Finance does. I mean, it's a lending protocol. It's a way to programmatically lend out money. But as we can see, they lost almost $200 million because some other set of actors wrote a adversarial program to interact with their program. That's not going to help. It's not going to help us get to a place where, again, the average person is willing to carry ETH to buy a sandwich. Fortessa Latifi, Teen Vogue, a YouTuber who went viral as a toddler, says she resents her family for monetizing her childhood, as some influencer parents take their children off social media. Yes, this is important. This is, I think on Friday, some point last week, pretty sure it was Friday, uh, I said that as bizarre as it may feel, I believe we are in the early innings of social media. We're still in the first act, arguably, and that we have much further to go before we circle in on some sort of cohesive, tangible definition of what these things are and what they're good for and what they're not good for and what's responsible and what's irresponsible behavior as users. The fact that I'm sure this YouTuber is not alone as someone who had no agency and very little input into the decision to make their life into a product which was then sold, um, it's not good. It's not what anybody, I think, would defend. As an adult, choosing to put some aspect of your life out for public consumption in exchange for, you know, some type of compensation, whether that be, audience or direct monetary, revenue, anything else. You get to make that choice as a grown up. But if you're a toddler, no one's equipping you to make that choice. So, yeah, it's gross. Dina Bass, Bloomberg. After Microsoft invested $1 billion in OpenAI in 2019, the company scrambled to string together tens of thousands of NVIDIA A100 GPUs, costing several hundred million. Okay, I don't really know that there's a lot to be said about that. I suppose we could have some kind of examination of how these new forms of software, what we're calling AI, rely on a type of hardware which is made by a very small set of businesses, and that NVIDIA, really being the 800-pound gorilla in that space, will have a series of expected and unexpected consequences, right? The expected consequence is NVIDIA is a remarkably valuable company, and the products that they make will continue to be in high demand in the market, regardless of what their application may be, right? It may be more difficult to get a hold of an NVIDIA powered GPU in order for you to play video games on a x86 machine, because those same chips are more and more valuable for these sorts of applications. It also, paints a target on NVIDIA's back. If you're serious about this business, if you're Microsoft and you're making a strategic investment in OpenAI, you ought to be looking at anybody else who is a competitor with NVIDIA or in the semiconductor business more broadly, and saying, is there an opportunity to make investments here so that we don't all wind up relying on NVIDIA's products in order to move the ball forward? This is it's related. I can't quite cleanly describe how, but it's related to the story from last week about the levels of energy consumption that these sorts of tools require. The chips are what, burn electricity in order to spit out the end results. But quite frankly, like, this is what progress looks like, I think. There aren't a tremendous amount of defensible applications of OpenAI yet. Like, there's some interesting things, but I have yet to see anyone build something that doesn't have this sort of aroma of dehumanization, right? Like, they're there to produce imagery, and some of the imagery is interesting, but we used to ask human beings to produce imagery. They're also used to produce text. We used to ask human beings to produce text. And there's a sort of sadness in me, as someone who appreciates the creative arts, in seeing human beings be replaced there. But we replaced horses with automobiles. The world got better in a wide variety of ways. We now are going to replace automobiles operated by human beings with automobiles operated by software. Say what you will, I personally continue to believe that that will be a better world than the one that we currently inhabit. But Microsoft having to go spend a few $100 million on NVIDIA chips, they have the balance sheet. I think they'll be okay.